they're still going to and clap, 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 right? These people who really have no scruples. It's just Trump always right. And Sean Hannity frequently talks to the president, I'm sure, and he will go on Fox News and yell and scream about how Putin is a dictator and how it's great that Trump is finally showing him who's boss. It's like, well, if he does, that would be the same way that Biden, quote, showed Putin who was boss too, because it's the same behavior, sending military arms to Ukraine. And so I will give Trump a lot of grief if he does send more aid to Ukraine. I am not team always Trump. I'm also not team never Trump. There's a lot of people on the right that have turned sour against Trump. I have an interview coming out soon where I had an RX enthusiast back on, and there's a lot of the good things that Trump has done, and we talked about some of them there. I'm not going to make this episode all about Trump doing good things. It'll instead be about some of the important headlines I've mentioned. But the point is that this war has been going on for far too long. It's very possible that what Trump says is true, that Putin saw the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan and thought, well, if Biden's going to do stupid stuff like that, he's probably not going to do a whole lot if I invade Ukraine. But the thing is, I don't know, because if that's the case, it seems to be a miscalculation. We have not gotten into a hot war with Russia, but it has been not only a Cold War with Russia, but a proxy war where we have sent billions of dollars in both money and in weapons to Ukraine, and in economic aid, foreign aid, so forth and so on. And so that seems like, if we're going to use this whole thing like, we use with Trump, 4D chess, sounds like Putin's chess move back in 2022 did not play off very well. He's kind of putting himself in a very, very long, difficult stalemate. Now, is Russia losing the war? No, overall, they're winning the war, but they're losing a lot of soldiers as well, and time, money, and resources. And so they're going to eventually want to come to the table too. So that's an important thing worth noting. Now, if I had to guess, and I'll talk a little bit after I read some headlines about what I think is going to happen. I want to remind you guys, this is the monologue portion. I will soon not only be doing things with the monologue, but also read your chats later, because I want to hear your thoughts. But if I had to guess what is going to end up happening with this war between America and Russia, really is what it is, with Ukraine caught in the middle, most likely what I think will happen is eventually Putin will come to the table because Zelensky comes to the table first. And then Trump will broker some kind of a deal in which neither one fully gets what they want, but the war will be done for, I would say at the least the war will be done for 10 years. It might even, the ceasefire might break sooner than that. But I would say the war will probably be paused for 10, 20 years, and then eventually Russia's either going to decide they want more, or someone in Ukraine is going to do something stupid, and Putin will move back in. It could be, because, Ukraine has conducted bombings of their own civilians in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, people that refused to speak the Ukrainian language and they wanted to speak Russian, and also voted in a way that Ukraine didn't want. They voted to join Russia, which, of course, Zelensky and his predecessor did not like. So that's the upshot. It's the big 5,000-foot view of what I'm going to be covering. The military-industrial complex is really doing their best to get their hooks into Trump. I didn't even mean to read this, but I think that I'm going to. There's a really interesting article. I'm going to find it real quick and read it to you. Let me see if I can find it. But I'm sorry, excuse me. There's an article written by the Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin, who has been called Putin's brain in the sense that, he's smarter than Putin, or he does a lot of Putin's thinking for him. Not sure how much that's true. He's the philosopher guy that actually helps Putin do what he wants to do. He kind of gives the theory behind it all. And so some people don't like Alexander Dugin. I find him to be an extremely intelligent man. But he wrote an article recently that I really wanted to read out loud. MAGA, GOP, and Trump is the title of this article. The Last Battle for Sovereignty. Let me see if I can quickly screen share it. By the way, if quality gets worse because of it, let me know. But I'm going to at least briefly show you the headline. So here is the article: MAGA, GOP, and Trump, the last battle for sovereignty, and that is by Alexander Dugin. I'll hide it back again. I'm going to read it a little bit. Not the whole thing, but some. I will say Dugin seems to really view MAGA as being a whole lot more anti-war than I do. I view MAGA as, in a lot of ways, a bunch of grandmas with Walmart flags, as Razorfist like to say. But he views it as a little bit more of a congruent movement against war and hardcore on the border. Definitely hardcore on the border. And old MAGA was. 2016 MAGA definitely was. But I think MAGA has evolved over time. MAGA is really important political and ideological phenomenon, and the grammar is not always going to be the best because this is probably originally in Russian but been translated. It was essential in Trump's victory, but Trump is compromised, so yeah, bad grammar, between GOP and MAGA. Trump, driven by MAGA, has won elections, but afterwards passed to GOP with its neocon core. GOP neocons want Trump to abandon MAGA irreversibly and become neocon. I presume that infights in MAGA are instrumentalized and somehow provoked by the GOP. So now we have three units: neocon GOP, MAGA in full disarray, and individual Trump, so Trump himself, posing as sovereign dictator on the top of both. In fact, MAGA is a third party symmetric to the uniparty of deep state, meaning the neocons, the globalists, and radically opposed to it. So you've got the uniparty of the deep state on the one side, is what he's saying when he says symmetric. That's the deep state and the uniparty on one side. Then on the other side, you've got MAGA, diametrically, radically opposed to it. The different figures of MAGA now fight each other. So uniparty is dismantling MAGA as a serious threat that gained huge influence. Vance is regarded as a second chance to repeat Trump's move, compromise between MAGA and GOP. But GOP neocons now feels itself too powerful to tolerate Vance. Vance is most likely to be the key person in MAGA instead of being as well severely criticized by frustrated MAGA. Okay, so that is some of what he wrote. And again, he really Dugin overall views MAGA as being a little bit more congruent. I really view MAGA as starting to become the establishment because, for example, Lara Trump is now a leader in the Republican Party. You can't say that MAGA, the organization started by Trump, is no longer part of the Republican Party. It is, because someone in the Trump family, who's probably taking orders from her father-in-law, meaning Donald Trump, taking these orders, she's running the Republican Party with Michael Whatley, their co-chairs of the Republican Party, right? So as a result, MAGA is split. There's those like Sean Hannity, who calls himself a Ronald Reagan, what's the other term? Maybe like a compassionate or No Child Left Behind. And then also an America First or Make America Great Again conservative. That's what Hannity called himself. He's no more America First than the man in the moon. He's completely against America First. He is all about the neocon and the neoconservative welfare and warfare state. Sean Hannity loves all that. He's very establishment. So does Ben Shapiro, by the way. I mean, I'm not going to leave him out of this. But the point that I'm making is that MAGA is moving into the GOP establishment, except for people like Bannon, except for people like Tucker Carlson. If you want to call someone like Nick Fuentes and the Groypers part of the MAGA movement, they're also not part of the establishment or part of the GOP either. I don't really refer to Fuentes as the Groypers, but they're a little bit hard to ignore because of the fact that a lot of young people are in that movement. But I view them as sort of being a bit of a fringe group, not that mainstream. But they're growing because of the influence on Instagram in particular. But with the point being that MAGA is very fractured, which is something that Dugin does say. He says that MAGA is in full disarray, right? So with all that being said, there's just a lot going on with that. And we're now going to look at, speaking of, I mentioned Trump a second ago and Putin, what all is being said. We have an article, our first story before I even go to Trump and Putin. A Hispanic woman tried to call the cops on a white woman and her child and file a hate crime report. The offense that this was phoned in, this hate crime, to tell the story, this woman was extremely, extremely sad because she was standing behind a woman in line. Evidently, they were at a Walmart the white woman and her child were talking about the boy's birthday party. This Hispanic woman overheard the boy say, "Mommy, I would like to have an alien themed birthday party." And the mom, very confused, said, "Why, honey? Your birthday's not on Cinco de Mayo." And this Hispanic woman was infuriated and tried to call this into the cops. And that is from totallynotnonsense.com. That's my source for that one. Okay, so we're now going to get to our first real story. That was a joke for those of you who are a little bit slow. Kentucky clerk still fighting. That's a little later. I actually clicked on the wrong thing. Flub. I had to have a Bidenism or what's his name? Fetterman, since I'm a tall guy. I messed up kind of like Fetterman. Hello, everybody. Good night. That's what Fetterman says. All I need is a goatee and a hoodie. Zelensky says Trump pursuing Ukraine ceasefire at Putin's summit. So, in other words, Zelensky is saying, well, Trump wants a ceasefire on Ukraine's side. He doesn't really care about what's going on with Russia. That's how he's phrasing this. And I'll read about some specifics about some of the claims that were made. But yeah, it's Zelensky is not on anyone's side except himself. Even the side of the Ukrainian people. If you want to make the argument that he cares about Ukraine, I got to disagree with you, because Zelensky is getting money from this Ukraine aid. He doesn't care about his country. If he did, you want to know how I know he doesn't? Because if he did, then he would have already had a deal. There would be a deal. And as a result, he doesn't really care because it's all about the money in his pockets. That's what matters to him. This article is from NPC. Zelensky, Trump's pursuing Ukraine ceasefire. From NPC. Zelensky, Trump pursuing Ukraine ceasefire. This is written the 13th. So, in other words, he wants Ukraine to have a ceasefire. European leaders met virtually with President Trump on Wednesday, urging him to press Russian President Vladimir Putin for a ceasefire and security guarantees for Ukraine before any peace talks begin. The Trump-Putin meeting is set for Friday in Alaska without Ukraine's president at the table. At a joint news conference with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz in Berlin, Ukrainian President Volodymyr, however it's pronounced, Zelensky said Trump agreed that Russia must commit to those terms before negotiations start. Merz said Europe, NATO, and Trump were in broad agreement on next steps, including rejecting legal recognition of Russian-occupied territory. Merz warned that Europe's security and democracy are at stake. You can just hear the dramatic music playing in the background if Russia's invasion goes unchallenged, saying Putin could target other nations if allowed to keep land taken by force. This strategy is based on supporting Ukraine and putting pressure on Russia. So if in Alaska there is no movement on the Russian side, then the U.S. and the Europeans need to increase the pressure. Speaking later at the Kennedy Center in Washington, Trump called the meeting friendly and rated it a 10. He said there's a very good chance of a follow-up summit with Putin and Zelensky almost immediately if Friday's talks go well. But he also warned that very severe consequences await Russia if there's no ceasefire deal. So what are those very severe consequences is the question. Still, Trump acknowledged he doesn't believe he can stop Putin from targeting civilians, casting doubt on the chances for a quick truce. I've had a lot of good conversations with him. Then I go home and I see that a rocket hitting a nursing home or a rocket hitting an apartment building, and people are laying dead in the streets. So I guess the answer to that is no, because I've had this conversation. And that was from Trump. Putin now controls nearly 20% of Ukraine, including Crimea and most of 4 eastern regions. He's demanding that Ukraine withdraw from remaining territory there and abandon plans to join NATO. Demands Kyiv call unconstitutional and unacceptable. So we have that article from NPC. We also have, highlights. I have some highlights to read you real quick. I don't want to go on to this too much. Of Putin's statement after this summit with Trump. So what all was said at the meeting? Let's get some highlights of things Putin said. This article looks like was written yesterday. Following are key quotes from Russian President Vladimir Putin's statement after meeting President Donald Trump in Alaska on Friday. Before I read that, I want to remind everybody to like this on Rumble. Please like this. Please like it on YouTube as well. Retweet it if you're watching on X. Would really appreciate that. It helps the algorithm. As it is known, Russian-American summits have not been held for more than 4 years. This is a long time. The past period was very difficult for bilateral reasons, and let's be honest, they have slid to the lowest point since the Cold War. And this is not good for our countries or the world as a whole. Obviously, sooner or later, it was necessary to correct the situation to move from confrontation to dialogue. And in this regard, a personal meeting of the heads of the two states was really overdue. So that was something that Putin said. As you well know and understand, one of the central issues has become the situation around Ukraine. We see the desire of the U.S. administration and President Trump personally to facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict, his desire to delve into the essence and understand its origins. I have said more than once that for Russia, the events in Ukraine are associated with fundamental threats to our national security. Moreover, we have always considered and consider, meaning they consider now, the Ukrainian people. I have said this many times, brotherly, no matter how strange this may sound in today's conditions. We have the same roots, and everything that is happening for us is a tragedy and a great pain. Therefore, our country is sincerely interested in putting an end to this. But at the same time, we are convinced that in order for the Ukrainian settlement to be sustainable and long-term, all the root causes of the crisis must be eliminated. That's a quote from Putin.